Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Saima Desai. Last week, The Breach released an investigation into a secret network set up by Canadian universities to crack down on their students' Palestine activism. Journalists used access to information requests to paint a picture of two parallel networks, one national and one in Alberta. Inside those two networks, universities were coordinating with each other to spy on and violently clear encampments set up by students and community members who were calling for an end to Israel's genocide in Gaza. My guests today are Euan Thomson and David Slater, the two journalists behind the investigation. Euan is the founder of Drug Data Decoded, an Alberta drug policy analysis website. David is a data journalist who has written extensively about institutional accountability. Thank you for joining us today, Euan and David.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And as we get started, just a reminder to our audiences to like and subscribe if you want more bold journalism for transformation. The response to this investigation has been pretty significant. Can you tell me what it was in this story that made waves among Palestine organizers, university faculty, and critics of the Alberta government?
I think that in the fallout of all the violence that happened on campuses, particularly at the University of Calgary and the University of Alberta in May 2024, there were some significant questions that were remaining in a lot of people's minds, particularly people who had been beaten or arrested, as I was in the case of the University of Calgary protest, and that it seemed unreasonable that these universities hadn't been coordinating their responses in some ways, and particularly with the provincial government's sort of attempts to distance itself from any involvement with this. I think a lot of people were a little bit skeptical of both of those things. It just seemed all too coordinated to a lot of people. So that's really what David and I were going after with this investigation that took us approximately 16 months, really almost upwards of 2 years if you count right back to the very initial request that we submitted to the universities.
You both have personal connections to the universities in this story. So Euan, you and 8 other plaintiffs have launched a lawsuit against the City of Calgary, Calgary Police Service, and the University of Calgary. Can you take me through the process of reporting this story from the early days, how it got started? What caused you to first begin looking into universities and colleges' crackdown on Palestine encampments?
It actually came about in the earliest days because I was trying to defend myself against these legal charges that had been brought against me and several other people. We all knew they were bogus, but we needed to get the information from these institutions. And so right from the earliest days in May 2024, we were submitting requests to Calgary Police, to the university, and trying to get behind the scenes of how these decisions got made to deploy upwards of 100 police officers to the University of Calgary campus. Unprecedented violent police response, with riot cops, flashbangs, pepper grenades, all this stuff, this really shock and awe sort of response, to suppress what amounted to a peaceful protest of people with a few tents, who had cleared out those tents. People were just singing and holding hands essentially at the end of the night when the cops rushed and charged and beat a lot of protesters. And so, we needed to get inside of those decisions to defend ourselves legally. And we were successful to some extent with that. But once we started pulling on some of those threads, it became obvious that there was a lot being covered up. And that's where David came into the story, really, kind of some partway through about 2025.
I had done some reporting through the Progress Report, and we were both doing FOIPing as a sort of a basis of our reporting. And so once we connected, it was really obvious that we were approaching and reporting on the same things. Euan had some leads on this potential Alberta emergency management chat, and so this was our first group of FOIPs that went out to the University of Calgary, to the University of Alberta, and MacEwan University, and then that's just really where it all began. Some initial fact checking that I did was checking through some sources at MacEwan about, is this a real thing? Does it actually exist? And they confirmed for me. And so we were at that point really off to the races, that we knew that we had something solid.
Right. So, what is FOIPing for listeners who don't already know?
So freedom of information and protection of privacy, that falls under different names in different provinces. When you hear somebody say freedom of information, FOI, FOIA, FOIP, all of that, it's the same sort of process of submitting a request to a public body for any type of information. So any government institution, including the police, universities who are sort of there by statute of government, um, and health bodies, all of that falls under freedom of information law. So um, if you have questions about why police were deployed to your campus to quash a protest that happened, for example, then you can ask that university for the documents related to, say, the correspondence, the emails, the team's chat messages, all that kind of stuff that might be related to the decisions that were made to deploy those police to your campus. And you can also ask the police for those same records. And in this case, we did both.
Yeah, and as it turned out, those records, that process of FOIPing, of requesting public records, actually kind of became a big part of the story in itself. It was a story not only about universities collaborating to suppress campus Palestine activism, it also became a story about how universities destroyed and withheld records about that collaboration. So you two spent 16 months, as you've said, filing access to information requests and fighting to get those records. Can you tell me about how, through those efforts, a picture of the collaboration started to emerge?
It began with some initial responses that started to show lapses or not deletions at first, but what became this effort to roadblock us. And then what became clear through some subsequent responses and parallel requests that both Euan and I had put in to the MacEwan University, but that I received nothing back, and then Euan had received 28 pages of documents. And so why would MacEwan, deliver documents to one journalist but not another? And so then in our University of Alberta request, what became clear was that University of Alberta was going to other public bodies to check on like what should be released or not. But the University of Alberta had told us that it was MacEwan that was advising on documents. And so also that raises the big red flag for us. How can MacEwan advise another public body on release of documents when they tell one journalist that those documents don't even exist? And so it became this train of contradictions that we began documenting. And using the ATI process, it revealed this strategy of delay, delete, and deny.
These strategies played out across the institutions that we were requesting records from. I mean, we saw this play out with the University of Calgary versus the records that we got from Calgary Police. Surprisingly, Calgary Police was the more transparent of the two. University of Calgary tried to pretend that no records existed when we had, in the other hand, all of the same records that we had already gotten from a parallel request to Calgary Police. So when we went to the University of Toronto asking about this national network, they sort of played the same game. It was okay. We know that there's this Microsoft Teams chat inside of this SharePoint site that you've got, where all these security managers are presumably talking about the encampments. can you hand over all of these Teams chats? We'd like to see those, please. And it took us, quite a few back and forths with the university, but they eventually sort of fessed up to having likely deleted all of those records under a new policy that they introduced right at the end of the summer in 2024, conveniently enough, right after all of those consequential conversations would have been had among security managers from universities and colleges across the country about how they were going to respond to encampments.
Right. So it was kind of a process of receiving documents and kind of laying them on top of one another to see where one document filled in the gap of a different document, and where one institution would disclose something that another institution said had been destroyed.
Very much, very much.
And so one of the major revelations from this investigation is about Taylor Dome, who is a provincial government official in the Alberta network. And what you found from the documents that you received was that Dome was a part of the Alberta network in which universities were talking about and planning their response to encampments. Why did your ears kind of perk up when you read that there was an Alberta government official in this network?
David and I, at the same time, I think, realized this was one of the smoking guns we'd been looking for. The Alberta government really went to great lengths to distance itself from the violence that happened, and we know how close the Alberta government is with its police forces in the province. Um, Jeremy Appel, for example, had written about in 2025 how the chief of staff to the premier, Danielle Smith, um, wrote to Chief Mark Neufeld at Calgary Police after the encampment violence, and sort of congratulated him. So we were always looking for this smoking gun of like, was the government involved beforehand, not just afterwards? Because Danielle Smith got up in front of the microphones on May 10th, right after the morning after the Calgary violence, and kind of just told the public, like, we're taking cues from the university here. This has nothing to do with us. We're waiting to see what the University of Alberta does, but I'm really happy with the response that the University of Calgary took, and that was kind of the end of it. So, I think most of us looked at that and said, "There's no way. There's no way she's not involved." And so we were always looking for that person who was the back channel between the UCP government and some of these security managers. We already knew that there was a meeting with the public safety minister, Mike Ellis, with somebody from the premier's office, and with some high level executives at the universities, like president level kind of, and they also after the fact kind of said, there was nothing in there. We were going to be totally conciliatory towards these encampments. We were going to let them happen, no problem, whatever. And that was in the official report from the University of Alberta released at the end of 2024, in this independent analysis by a retired judge. But we didn't know about this secret back channel that Taylor Dom was sort of representative of, and he was with the Alberta Ministry of Advanced Education. So he was right there in the meeting with them, this secret meeting. They even sort of referred to it in secretive terms, saying this meeting is not going to be recorded. Somehow we ended up getting meeting notes out of this that were recorded by McEwen's representative, and and so at that point we were kind of off to the races with one of these smoking guns we'd been looking for.
So Alberta is so much a part of this story, in part because both of you have your own connections to Alberta. Euan, you were at the University of Calgary encampment when it was cleared. David, you are a McEwen student. And one thing I was interested about in this investigation is that the records that you obtained uncovered this kind of keystone role that MacEwan University played in the Alberta network. So the major scenes of police violence kind of played out at the University of Alberta and the University of Calgary, but you found that it was actually MacEwan University, a relatively small undergraduate university in downtown Edmonton, that hosted and administered the Alberta network. So I was wondering, why do you think this particular university was so central in the effort to suppress Palestine advocacy on campuses?
That is That is a really interesting question that I think I would love to ask somebody in the Alberta government or in the MacEwan administration about this because I'm not a student at MacEwan. I have never been a student there, but as somebody that went to U of A and looked across the river at this downtown campus, very sort of pro-business orientation, very much in lockstep with the UCP government's mandate around protecting business interests at all costs. There's a lot of there's political announcements that get made at MacEwan. There's all this kind of stuff um, that you don't normally see at universities. University of Alberta is famous for giving David Suzuki an award and taking a massive amount of public of government backlash for that act. So kind of two polar opposites, I think, at least in the Alberta landscape. Um, so it actually makes sense to me in some ways that MacEwan would be the sort of central hub of this, particularly given the opening of its Trefoil Hall School of Business that was happening that morning of the encampments that started on both campuses, the University of Calgary and University of Alberta on May 9th. Um, and when we started digging into this, um, the naming of this hall, it turned out it was the named for this former CEO and chair of Stantec, which just happened to have some um, business activity with the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, in Gaza and the West Bank over the last few years. So there's a sort of connection there right into the genocidal activity happening over there.
It's really not, anything surprising as a MacEwan student. And I don't want to generalize to say that, this is what everybody is saying, but that like it's very well known that, our school is friendly and partnering with, current government of Alberta, UCP. There's a culture of silence, like we can't talk about Palestine. And if we do, it's always couched, with Israel's right to exist. There's been multiple student demonstrations that have been met with backlash, in some form or another, discipline for the students. So it's very much in line with MacEwan taking this like kind of lead key role, but while maintaining like staying in the shadows underneath the bigger universities like the University of Alberta and University of Calgary.
David did a great job of reaching out to some of the students at MacEwan, and I just thought this was a really sad story. Some of these students, what they experienced, at the hands of MacEwan University for their activism, apparently, being investigated for misconduct. One of them was found guilty of causing a disruption. They were barred from university activities. One of them basically couldn't go to her convocation. I mean, just a lot of students suffered a lot of different things over that period. But you just look at the people who are stepping up, some of these heroic students that were putting so much on the line at that time, and the way they were treated by their institutions who should have been behind them on this. There's no excuse for any institution in this country in May 2024 to have been going after students in that way. They should have been supporting their right to free expression and assembly. These are charter rights. The universities stomped all over them and then dragged those students through the mud.
And I mean, it's now been 2 years since those encampments for Palestine were established, and so many of them were violently shut down. Even if they weren't violently shut down, often the students faced these really draconian punishments. Over those 2 years, you two, among other journalists that you've mentioned, Jeremy Appel, many others, have done now years of research and reporting into how governments and police and universities responded to these encampments. Do we have a complete picture of why and how universities cracked down so hard on Palestine encampments, and what remains untold?
We don't. No, we don't. There's so much we don't know, and I think that really that's been like the core of what we've been able to uncover through our investigation is, yes, we got all of these documents, but so much was deleted. right, Ewan? Like months and months of correspondence, emails, any sort of communications, like all of that is gone. And I think that what that tells us is that there's so much more that we don't know.
There's still a lot to come. We've got a lot of appeals. There's a lot of redactions we're trying to have lifted. There are, legal procedures about to come due. So, more and more will come out as time goes on. But as of right now, that there's not a whole lot of people speaking up from that period. There's nobody stepping forward with information and just handing over some of the documents, which would probably be the right thing to do for some of these security managers. Not a peep, and we can't get an answer from any of them really directly.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this really speaks to the importance of not just the work that we're doing, through the breach here, Jeremy Appel we've mentioned, but like that we're independent, right? We're non-mainstream. And I think that we're really like cutting the edge with this reporting. And we're using, hard documents to base our reporting off of. And no one else is doing this, right? We have some surface reporting, during the encampments. We have, some follow-up reporting, through mainstream press of, like some high-level reporting, but like no one has investigated this. This has really been something that has been really important for Euan and I. That like the type of work that we're doing, this like public service journalism, is really important in helping us understand what happened and bringing us back to May 2024.
Yeah, over at the breach, we were interested to see this story go in a small way kind of viral, because some of the details contained in the story have kind of been coming out slowly over the course of the last couple of years, and then of course there's some brand new stuff in there, but it does seem to sort of be this process of slowly wresting information out of universities and police forces. One thing that we've seen is people looking at this list of 30 universities and colleges that were part of the national network that were secretly collaborating on their response to Palestine encampments, and saying, oh, my institution was on this list, or no, my institution wasn't on this list. That must mean that they responded well, or in a sort of justifiable way to Palestine advocacy by their students and community members. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've seen in the response from readers since the article has come out, and how that kind of hews with or diverges from your experience of, what you've actually seen about how universities have responded to Palestine encampments and to disclosing information about their decision making?
Yeah, I think there are vanishingly few institutions that come out looking good at the end of all of this. And you're right, there have been a lot of people online sort of celebrating their institution for not showing up in these lists. But I would caution those people and maybe even encourage them to submit their own Freedom of Information requests to find out what was going on inside their institutions, because a lot of the institutions that we know were being really heavy-handed with their students, across Quebec, for example. Are not showing up in this list. So we know they were up to some bad things. Just because they weren't in this security managers network at that particular time does not mean we should let them, get away with the things that they did do and that have been documented, and the harms that fell on students primarily during that period. So, again, like, just, you can count on one hand the number of institutions in Canada that look okay coming out of this. U Windsor being one example that sort of stands out, meeting with students, formulating some sort of agreement, putting it out publicly, being transparent about what they're willing to do and not do. There were almost no other institutions in this country that did anything like that.
We're working in a really kind of local way on this issue of ending the genocide in Gaza. And in many ways, requesting records to understand the decision making of universities around Palestine encampments can feel kind of far away from the big picture of what will it take to stop a genocide. Can you talk to me about why this kind of accountability journalism is important in the larger struggle against the genocide in Gaza?
I think that what we've been able to uncover in this investigation is to show that, and if anybody's familiar with the term imperial boomerang, that it's a real thing. And that what we do far away, what we do in Palestine, what we do in the Middle East, what we do in Russia, Ukraine, has negative consequences. These things return to us, and what we're doing by facilitating a genocide, our state is doing this by selling weapons, by buying surveillance equipment, by partnering with these technology companies that are Israeli based, is that comes home here. And what we're seeing is a replication, and this is something that Noor Salhi had talked about when we interviewed her, is that what she's experiencing, what students are experiencing, is this draconian surveillance, right? Repression of rights. And I think that what's important about this investigation and this type of reporting is that we're contributing to the revelations and the documentation of this in the public interest and in the public sphere. We are helping to provide evidence to have a conversation that students and faculty and others, when they challenge these universities for violating their charter rights, we now have something in the public record to refer to.
I think also a lot of people came away from May 2024 and on into July 2024 in Ontario when everything got dismantled, feeling pretty helpless and just not really knowing how to seek accountability and justice on their campuses and in their communities. And I hope that this gives people a bit of a roadmap forward. There are ways to get information if you're asking the right question and you're being persistent. There are ways to hold people accountable and name the names of the people who cause this harm to people. So I think that that's something for people to take away from this for sure. I think on a broader scale as well, there's a sort of erosion of the ability of universities and colleges to survive in this current neoliberal climate, and this really became apparent to anybody who was watching this play out, and the ways that the universities appeared to have to make these horrible decisions to suppress their students' rights to protest. Who was holding those strings to push them to do that? Because I'm sure most of the people in the administrations of these universities didn't want to see their students get hurt, right? They didn't want to see their students' rights get trampled on, but they did, and these people willingly made these decisions. So what was it that was pushing them to do that? I'm very curious to keep scratching away at that, because I think really at the end of the day that will answer a lot of questions for why universities behave in a lot of different ways that we are constantly wondering about.
Still a lot to find out about universities' decision-making processes and their incentives, but you two have done some pretty formidable work. So thank you for the work that you did on this story.
You were an amazing editor, Saima. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much for joining me on the Breach podcast. If you like what you've heard on the Breach Show, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. You can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thank you for listening.